Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I'm your host, Ken Ford, IHMC's founder and CEO Emeritus. Rumor has it that I also chair the Double Secret Selection Committee, responsible for choosing all the guests who appear on STEM Talk. My co-host, Dawn, is still playing hooky, so I'm flying solo for this episode. Today, we have Doctors Michael Griffin and Lisa Porter, co-founders and co-presidents of LogiQ Inc, a company providing high-end management, scientific, and technical consulting services. My interview with Michael and Lisa occurred 10 days before Michael gave congressional testimony on China's ambitions to build a permanent colony on the moon and the risks this poses for the United States and our national security. Here I have a quote from the testimony by Michael Griffin. "We have squandered a 60-year head start on pioneering the space frontier to a nation that, without reason or provocation on our part, has chosen to become our nation's adversary," said Michael in his opening comments to Congress. We will include a link to Michael's testimony in our show notes for today's episode. Many of the points Michael made in his testimony are echoed in my rather candid interview with Michael and Lisa over their concerns about NASA's Artemis mission and its plans to return humans to the moon. Both Michael and Lisa have extensive backgrounds working at NASA, the Department of Defense, and on national security issues more broadly. Mike's background includes roles as the former Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the Administrator of NASA, the Space Department Head at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, as well as the Chairman and CEO of Schafer Corporation, among other high-level positions. Lisa's background includes roles as the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, the founding director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Associate Administrator for Aeronautics at NASA. Before I jump into my conversation with Mike and Lisa, we have a little bit of housekeeping. First, a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed to STEM Talk, and an extra thanks to all of you who have left those wonderful 5-star reviews. If you're new to the show and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing. And if you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to take a moment to rate the show and maybe even leave us a review. It really helps us reach more people who might enjoy STEM Talk. As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been hard at work, scouring iTunes and other podcast apps for the sharpest, funniest, and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to share on STEM Talk. If your review makes the cut and you hear it on the show, send us a note at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your very own official STEM Talk t-shirt, proof the committee does in fact exist. Today, our winning review was posted by a colleague named Duncan. The Double Secret Selection Committee has a strong bias toward reviews crafted by colleagues. Hence, Duncan's rather skimpy review was the choice. Duncan enjoyed our conversation with Dr. J.P. Errico, another colleague, about vagus nerve stimulation on episode 179. Duncan's review reads, "What an educational episode on a topic I've never heard about before." Well, thank you, Duncan, and thanks to all our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success. Okay, and now on to today's interview with Doctors Michael Griffin and Lisa Porter.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Mike, it's good to talk with you again. And Lisa, welcome to STEM Talk.
Thank you.
I might add, this is your first appearance on STEM Talk, and we're very pleased about that. And I really appreciate the two of you joining us so we can have a discussion about NASA's current plans for a United States return to the lunar surface. Now, Michael, This is your third appearance on STEM Talk, so we will not be reviewing your impressive background in detail. Listeners can check out episodes 23 and episode 134, or review our show notes for today's interview to find out more about you and your background. But Lisa, since this is your first appearance on the podcast, I'd like to briefly touch on your background. You have a bachelor's degree in nuclear engineering from MIT. So what drew you to that subject?
Well, ever since I was little, this won't surprise you, I've loved science and math. And so I grew up as a small kid in the 70s, just to date myself, I guess. But I remember vividly still sitting in the back seat of a car in the gas lines. And at that time, the country was actually very worried about running out of gas, running out of oil, our dependency on foreign oil. That was a really prescient issue, I think, for people. It was front of center in most people's minds. And of course, I was very influenced by that. So as a kid in high school, I was reading up as much as I could on nuclear power. And I became fascinated with nuclear fusion, actually, because of the promise it had for essentially amazing amounts of energy, lower issues with radioactive waste. And so by the time I went to MIT, I knew that's what I wanted to do. I was absolutely convinced I wanted to go into nuclear engineering with a focus on fusion. And that's what got me there. And I spent 4 years there, obviously, as an undergraduate, and learned a tremendous amount. And by the time I finished, one of the things I had learned was that it was very unlikely that fusion was going to be producing commercial energy, at least in my lifetime. Turns out I was right about that.
Yeah.
But the actual thing I think I would share with listeners is the process of starting with a hypothesis and really being willing to be open-minded about whether your hypothesis is correct or not. It sounds really obvious, but I think that's historically over my career been one of the biggest challenges, is learning to let go of things that you think are a good idea, but actually turn out not to be. The data doesn't support it. Or, in the jobs that Mike and I have had, convincing others of the same. Mm-hmm. So when I was actually at MIT, a couple of years before I got there was a professor. His name was Larry Linsky. He actually got in a lot of trouble because he was very supportive of fusion until he did his own math, his own assessment, if you will, and convinced himself that it was just not going to ever be commercially viable. And he tried to make the arguments very clearly and objectively. And as you can imagine, he became a pariah for most of the people in the fusion community for coming out and challenging some of these precepts. He stayed in the department and I got to meet him and he was fabulous. But I think as a young engineer, those are the kinds of lessons that are extremely important to learn, to be able to say, you know what, this isn't going to work the way we think it is. And it's not just about the technology ever. It's always about how the technology fits in a broader ecosystem, to include, very importantly, the economic proposition. So I just found that to be a very important early lesson, and that's why I'm sharing that with you, because it's a theme that Mike and I both have dealt with, I think, over the course of our careers. In fact, it will come up as we talk about the moon today.
It's a lesson that I wish as a society was more widely appreciated, even in the science community. It's become less and less that's the case over my career.
Exactly.
More rigidity, more ideological commitment to one's hypotheses.
Exactly. That expression, turning things into religion, that's exactly right. That's what we see. And that's not the way we should be behaving as scientists.
Definitely not.
Or engineers.
So following up on that question, what led you then to travel across the country from Boston to Stanford, where you earned a PhD in physics? So how did you pick Stanford and why physics? Though I can kind of see both, but you could tell us.
Yeah, Stanford's not a hard sell, to be honest. However, specifically the physics part, as I studied plasma fusion, I had to learn a lot about plasma physics, and I fell in love with the physics. And I ended up taking a lot of advanced physics courses at MIT, and I loved engineering as well, but I really wanted to explore more my passion for plasma physics in particular. And so I ended up at Stanford. I did look at various schools, and I will say that the quality of life there was a factor. It's nothing like coming from Boston and then, landing on the Stanford campus. It's very much Wizard of Oz-like. But I found that to be a really good place for me to to develop my skills on the physics side and to become deeper in domains of quantum and plasma, electromagnetism, and all of that. Applied it, believe it or not, to a not so applied problem, which was solar physics, and in particular, the coronal heating question of why is the corona 2 orders of magnitude hotter in temperature than the surface of the sun. So that was the sort of focus of my thesis, and it was quite a lot of fun, but also, obviously, like all good PhD programs, a really good learning experience.
I can imagine. It sounds like a nice transition. And as you said, from the cold and wet and windy Boston to sunny, sort of bucolic Stanford campus must have been easy sell.
It wasn't a hard sell, that's correct.
Yeah. So, Lisa, you are perhaps best known, though actually you're known for many things, but perhaps best known as the founding director of the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, otherwise known as IARPA. And this is a department within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And in that role, you are responsible for research geared toward helping the United States intelligence community overcome a multitude of challenges which it faces and continues to face. What were some of the more interesting challenges that you can talk about that you were interested in addressing during that era?
Well, IARPA was stood up as part of the many changes we saw, including the stand-up of the ODNI itself, post 9/11, right? The 9/11 Commission, which wasn't actually put into a law until, in terms of enacting those recommendations, until 2007. So the ODNI was stood up, and then soon thereafter, IARPA. The reason IARPA was stood up, it was actually a pretty obvious thing, was, the intelligence community needs its own DARPA. Most of the research that was going on in the intelligence community was focused more on the near term, and there wasn't this kind of, let's look a little further out, but let's really take on the risks that no one else can conceivably take on because of the potential payoff that some of those risks can lead to. So that sort of ethos of DARPA was recognized as so successful for the DoD, and that the IC really needed its own. And I had been very fortunate to work at DARPA and actually to collaborate on some of my programs with the IC, because there was sort of a dual-use component to some of the work we were doing. And I had therefore been exposed to the intelligence community and recognized not only some of the similarities of the challenges, but also importantly, the differences between the DoD and the IC. And because of, I think, the experience I had there and my passion for bringing that vision to the IC, I was asked to lead IARPA. And as you can imagine, the challenges of standing up a new organization are far less about the particular technical problems that you're faced with and far more about the cultural issues of bringing in a new way of doing things to an organization or a set of organizations that was, first of all, still trying to figure out how to realign itself to be better addressing the threats we were facing, but also just used to doing things in a very different way than the way DARPA operated. And most notably, I think the hardest challenge, frankly, was convincing the intelligence community that the idea of reaching out to the best and brightest to solve our hardest problems required us to be a lot more open and to sort of lift the veil, if you will, of the community and talk about the kinds of problems that we were dealing with and how we needed help in solving them. And this may sound really, really obvious, but for a community that operates, so to speak, in the shadows, that was a very, very difficult transition for them to embrace. But we were successful, I think, in developing a lot of purely unclassified efforts. We really worked hard to bring in the academic community in particular to help us solve some of the really pressing challenges. And it was a great time to be standing up IARPA because it was right before the social media tsunami as we know it today. We thought we were in a data tsunami then, but YouTube had just launched like 3 years prior to the stand-up. And people forget, but the first iPhone wasn't actually released until June of 2007. So most people were on BlackBerries, myself included. The concept of apps was very, very new. Instagram hadn't even been invented yet, or I should say created yet. And so it was right at that cusp where we were all recognizing the challenge of the tsunami of data that was going to be, overwhelming us, and how we needed to develop analytic tools to help the community get ahead of all of that and make appropriate assessments. What is the data actually telling us and what is it not telling us? So we were actually, I think, very effective in focusing on the analytic domain in particular. This was before AI as it is currently discussed and machine learning as it's usually talked about. Ken, I know you're an expert in those areas. It's before it became sort of commonplace. This was in the early days. So I found that to be a very exciting time to be part of an organization that was being stood up to look at these really hard problems and really develop capability. So it was a great opportunity, I have to say. It couldn't have been a better mission to be asked to serve.
And you were an ideal person for that mission. As you noted, those kind of jobs are the big challenge isn't usually a specific technical challenge. It's usually cultural. And,
yes.
And I think you were very well suited to that challenge. Prior to this, you were
I was lucky, right? Because I had just been working for Mike Griffin at NASA right before that. And one of the first things he ever told me there, and it's always stuck with me, was, you can always recognize the pioneers because they're the ones with the arrows in their chest. And the second thing he told me is if you're not ticking people off, you're probably not getting anything done. So those were lessons that I took from NASA over to IARPA because, you can't really expect to be the person getting a lot of love and affection when you're coming in to say we're going to do things really differently. Change is usually never welcome in an organization that's been around for a long time. So
absolutely. And you just mentioned your time as associate administrator for aeronautics at NASA, and you mentioned you had the opportunity to work with Mike in that role. How did you get connected to him, and how did you end up deciding to accept an offer to be the AA for aeronautics?
So I was at DARPA at the time as a program manager and really enjoying, of course, the time there. I've never met a DARPA program manager who doesn't enjoy their time. So it was a great job. And part of what I was looking at that time was actually, believe it or not, in a rotorcraft domain. And so because of that, I knew some folks at NASA, and I also had a good friend who was at the White House at the time. And it turned out he was a good friend of Mike Griffin's as well. And he was aware of what Mike was trying to do at NASA to really bring about big change, just like we were talking about. And Mike apparently was looking to do that in aeronautics as well as in exploration. And so this person said, "Hey, do you know Lisa Porter?" And Mike said, "No, but I'm happy to meet her if you recommend, I talk to her." And that's kind of how it started. I ended up, doing a couple interviews first before I got to meet Mike, but ultimately met Mike and we hit it off. I told him my vision for what I thought aeronautics should be focused on, and it just clicked. And so very soon after that, he offered me the position, and I was so impressed by him that I said, okay, I got to do this. This is a real big opportunity to make a difference.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen. I remember when you had that position at NASA pretty clearly, and I think you were effective in that role. And as you say, leadership requires some degree of arrow collecting, and everybody who's been anybody's been in a significant leadership role knows that.
Yes.
Well, turning to Mike, you must have enjoyed working with Lisa because when you became Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering back in 2018, you invited Lisa to become the Deputy Undersecretary for Defense Research and Engineering. Could you talk a little bit about Lisa and some of the qualities, and we've already heard some of the qualities, but some of the qualities that she brought to the table that made her sort of ideal for that important position?
Well, most everything that I could ever tell you about Lisa, you can figure out in 10 minutes talking with her, and it's merely a matter of recognizing the obvious. But I'll point out some specific qualities that she has that stand out to me. The first is, we talked about, being willing to re-examine your ideas in science and engineering and math, and those are crucial traits. The idea of, settled science is an oxymoron. Lisa is, and I don't say this with any intent to be hyperbolic, she's the best critical thinker that I've personally met. I have a lot of ideas. Occasionally one is good. If I can get one past Lisa with her questioning, I rest comfortably. There have been several specific occasions I could cite. I won't, but where I would advance a hypothesis. I was pretty sure I was right, and she would question it and make me go back and prove it. And I wouldn't subject myself necessarily to that kind of rigor if I didn't have someone I respected demanding it. So I really value that in our association, our collaboration. Lisa has what I could only say as iron integrity. She would never do anything she thought was wrong. And of course, integrity counts before anything else, really. She has the courage to stand up for her convictions. I've seen her do it many times. And when you're dealing with potentially the opprobrium of maybe a community that believes in settled science, having the courage of your convictions is really pretty important. And then, I can't finish without saying, I don't know that I know a smarter person. So, I like that a lot. I not that I have to put up with anything with Lisa, but I could put up with almost anything in exchange for intelligence, and she brings that. But the real question, the question you're not asking is why does she bother to put up with me? That's a whole different discussion. But anyway, I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, so it's a beautiful answer. And with respect to your last comment, I'm sure it's roughly a reciprocal function. And
it sure is. It sure is.
I don't see how that could be.
I'm always feel very uncomfortable when he says such nice things about me.
Yes.
But it's really always nice to hear it from someone that you respect so highly.
Absolutely.
To hear those things, yes.
You two obviously make a good team because today you are working together again as co-founders and co-presidents of LogiQ Incorporated, a company that provides scientific and technical consulting services. Mike, would you give us a brief overview of the type of work that LogiQ actually does?
Well, it's a mixture of things. We do a certain amount of what I'll just call technical diligence for the investment community, venture capital, private equity, where they're looking at mergers and acquisitions in our arena in aerospace and defense, and they need what they hope to be an expert opinion on the quality of the company, the quality of the tech, whether there's a real market for the company they're looking to buy. So that type of thing. Then we do a certain number every year of, I would say, detailed technical reviews. In fact, we have one tomorrow. We're part of a team often, or sometimes just by ourselves, that furnish independent eyes or fresh eyes on target. If you're doing a critical design review, it's too easy to fall into the trap of talking only to your own folks. And, you miss the elephant in the room. And so Lisa and I are both big believers in independent assessment. Ken, you'll recall when you were on the advisory committee at NASA and I was in my term as administrator, one of the first things we tried to do was to stand up, program assessment and evaluation. She and I both believe in the value of that, and we try to provide that to our customers. And then there's a certain chunk of work that we do that's mostly just involved with management, counseling, and interaction and consulting with the senior managers of the companies we advise and getting them to question their own assumptions and their own strategies. Lisa, I'll turn it over to you. What did I miss?
I think part of what we do for our clients is also what you would call a market assessment. Sometimes, as you can imagine, the hammer looking for a nail is an all too common problem, and making sure that our clients are thinking about, well, that's a great hammer, but it turns out there are a lot of other tools out there that work a lot better for that problem. And, things like that sounds simple, but it gets back to Mike's point of needing that independent look, that objective look, where you haven't fallen in love with your idea already. And, being smart and savvy enough about both the market, in other words, the users who are going to use the technology or solution, as well as being smart enough about the tech itself. So we enjoy that kind of work because I think you need to have an interest and a curiosity about both technology and the use of that technology to do that kind of work.
I can certainly see why you would both be good at that, and also that it would be of great value to a certain kind of client that had these requirements. In fact, I think many more organizations would benefit from such a service, but they just don't all realize it.
That is absolutely true. Yes.
We do. Our clients do tend to be people who want to hear what somebody believes to be the straight truth.
Yes,
exactly. And as we all know, that's not everyone.
No, it's a small subset of the universe.
Anyway.
So, turning to space exploration, two of the things I'd like to discuss today are, Mike, your congressional testimony on returning to the moon, and also especially the excellent paper the two of you wrote on a system architecture for an envisioned human lunar return. I like the paper very much. First of all, I think it would be good to explain for listeners why it's important that the United States successfully return to the moon. Right now, in addition to the United States, we have China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, India, and the United Arab Emirates, all in various stages of planning some kind of a mission to the moon. Can the two of you help our listeners understand why this is so important? But for now, why is it that all these nations have this interest in returning to the moon?
Well, I'll start by saying that the nations that you're speaking of, and many others as well, they want to be on the frontier of their time. And there are many frontiers of any time, but one of them is the physical frontier. And nations which have aspirations to be, in the leading edge of modern culture, in whatever era you're talking about for modern, want to be on the physical frontier of their time in one way or another. It's almost a defining characteristic in reading back through history of which are the influential and important nations. So, speaking just for myself, and Lisa will certainly get a turn in a moment, I'm an American. I want my country to be on the frontiers of its time, and with America's history, I think a position no less than first among equals is what we should aspire to, not only to explore and eventually use and develop that frontier, but also to guard it. When there are not guardians, the result is piracy, and that's not good for anybody really in the long run. So let me stop there. That I think is why nations that can afford to do so and want to be influential, that's why they want to be on the frontier.
Yes, it's really hard to put it into words, Ken. It's the greatness and the sort of the best of what man can accomplish, I think, is what going to the moon represents. And I myself hadn't even fully grokked that until I was at NASA working for Mike. And how many first-generation Americans I met. My deputy was actually first-generation Korean. He was a few years older than I was, and he talked about being in South Korea when we did that. And how exciting it was for him to see that. It transcended nations, to be honest. It was about this achievement that represented all of what a man's good could do. And it's so hard. I'm not very articulate, and I apologize, but it's so hard to put into words how monumental that achievement was, not just for the United States, but I think for all humans across the globe. And so it's natural, I think, as we progress as humanity, that we want to achieve those kinds of things. It brings out, frankly, the best in us. And when you meet people who were all over the world when we did that, and they all talk about it, not with envy, not with any kind of negativity, but with true positivity. And in many cases was the reason they studied engineering and or came to the United States. So I apologize if I sounded a little bit over the top, but I think it's really hard to put into words how important these kinds of achievements are. And this is why you see, I think, all the countries galvanizing behind wanting to do it. There's a national pride element that Mike talks about, absolutely, but it's also bigger than that in a good way.
Yes, it was pride in humanity.
Yes.
For a lot of our younger listeners, they've heard a lot about it and a lot about Apollo in general. But to have experienced it, it was unique in my lifetime in terms of just all around the world, millions and millions of people were unified in the expression of humanity's achievement.
Yes, very well said, Ken. Yes.
Well, as both of you are keenly aware, the U.S. faces a number of significant threats and challenges following up on the previous discussion with regard to China and its global ambitions, which go far beyond the moon, of course. But it's not just China's global ambitions that are a concern, but in the context of today's discussion, we want to discuss China's stated goal to be the first to return humans to the moon and to build a permanent presence on the lunar surface. Can you help listeners understand why it's important that the United States be the first to return humans to the moon? I mean, we did touch on this, but now I'm asking that in the specific context of China.
Well, I guess I'll start, and I'll point out that in any field of endeavor, the decisions are made by the people who show up. The standards are set, the ethics, the rules, the laws, the practices, the cultural behavior is established by people who are there, not people who are watching. The United States is a nation that, despite whatever backsliding or, lack of perfection we sometimes evidence, the United States is a nation that believes fundamentally in individual rights, the rule of law, property rights, intellectual property rights, the values, generally speaking, of Western civilization that emerged a couple of thousand years ago in the Mediterranean. And that is what we think of as Western civilization, the primacy of the individual over the state and over autocracy. The Chinese Communist Party, and I use that term because I really mean to distinguish it from the 94% of the Chinese population that are not members of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP does not share those values. They believe in the primacy of the party over the individual, and they believe in the primacy of the CCP over the rights and privileges and customs of other nations. And that ought to be unacceptable to the United States. Now, if you believe what Lisa just said, and I absolutely do, then the admiration and the respect that accrues to nations which are first on the frontier and persist in being on the frontier, that sways the cultures of peoples around the world. So the United States needs to ask itself, who do you want the other nations of the world, the peoples of the world, who do you want and what principles do you want them admiring? Do you want them admiring autocracy and might makes right and subjugation of smaller nations and smaller cultures? Or do you want them to value property rights, intellectual property, the rights of the individual, the primacy of the individual over the state, the right of self-determination in your government? Which set of values do you want the world to have? I actually am one of those who believes that the United States, as a great nation, does have certain responsibilities to help create the future we want to see. And we will not create that future by watching China on TV achieve great things.
So that was so beautifully said. It's hard to add to that, Ken, but I think the one thing I would emphasize that Mike didn't say is the point you made when you asked the question. It's not just about getting there first, but it's about establishing a presence there. And I think that's where we fell short the last time we went to the moon. So you could say, yes, the U.S. has done it first, but the outcome was short-lived because we didn't look upon that as something to then expand and grow and continue further exploration. So when we talk about being first and talking about exactly the points Mike made, it's not enough to just, quote, cross the finish line first, right? We really have to think about this as being the nation that explores and carries forward the principles we believe and hold to be true, not just for the immediate, yay, we won this one, but for all the generations to come in the future.
Absolutely. And, that returns us to the discussion we started earlier about the Apollo program. It was really an amazing accomplishment, a very interesting program itself as a program, and it was canceled under Nixon. It fell victim to, the typical thing, lots of other priorities, perspectives about legacy and whose program it was. In your mind, in your collective mind, do you see its cancellation as a mistake at the time? It seems to me that it was, but I want to hear what you both think.
Well, I was a working engineer at the time that the program was canceled. And I have to say, I said at the time and have said since it was a mistake for exactly the reasons that Lisa just articulated. It's not about doing something one time. It's about establishing a presence. I would ask you, talking again about the United States, what would have been the result for the North American continent if Thomas Jefferson had sent Lewis and Clark to the Pacific Ocean and they came back one time and we said, okay, we're done? it may have taken, it did take. In fact, I would argue that the United States is not really settled yet. When you fly over it in a light airplane, I will assure you most of the United States is empty. It's really, really, really empty.
Those are my favorite parts.
Yeah, I know you live in part-time in Wyoming, and I like them too. But my point is that it has taken a couple of 100 years to fully advantage ourselves of the vision that Thomas Jefferson had in purchasing from France what's called the Louisiana Purchase, and then beginning its settlement, its exploration and settlement. The utilization of the solar system for the benefit of mankind is in its infancy. It will take thousands of years to take advantage of it. It has taken thousands of years for humans to take advantage of what the earth itself offers. But it's like the old joke about, the best time to plant an oak tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today.
That's certainly true.
Exactly.
So given this strategic and thoughtful perspective you've both just offered, and we've been talking about now for some few minutes, let's think about where we are now, and in particularly now I turn to the Artemis program. Can you give our listeners an overview of the Artemis program from the perspective of an architecture, a space architecture? What's the overall best description?
I don't know that there's an overall best description. I think we can briefly describe it, although honestly your listeners would be better served by just Googling Artemis and following it from there. But to discuss it quickly, the current plan of the United States for returning to the moon involves two major contractors. SpaceX was the first contract and Blue Origin was the second. Each of them will launch a lunar lander capable of landing on the surface of the moon and returning from it. The transportation to the moon and the landing on the moon will require many, many refueling flights. Estimates range from 10 to well over 20, depending on the assumptions that you make, after which the crew will fly out to the moon in a different spacecraft, rendezvous with the lander, take the lander down and back up, and then come home to Earth. It's a very complicated sequence, and critical to the discussion is the fact that the orbit in which they are scheduled to rendezvous with the lander is one that allows a landing and critically a return only every 6.5 days. So from the perspective that Lisa and I put in our paper and that I provided in my testimony 23 months ago, you're at a substantial risk of stranding the crew on the moon for several days at a time if anything goes wrong. And just as someone who used to bear that responsibility for risking crew, it's just not a risk I would ever agree to take. And then there's the question is now seems to be becoming more popular than when I raised it 2 years ago, the issue of propellant boil-off when you're trying to transfer cryogenic fuel from one rocket cargo ship to a lander, trying to transfer that cryogenic fuel without having it boil off in space and being able to get positive traction on filling it up is a technical challenge that we haven't even come close to mastering. In fact, we've never really tried it. So putting very low, what we call TRL, technology readiness level technologies, in series with a program that you would like to move expeditiously is just not a good idea.
Yes, it's my view as well. Lisa?
So, Ken, as you can imagine, Mike can run circles around just about anybody when it comes to the detailed technical elements of this or any related. So when he and I were talking about this, I was asking sort of the higher level system engineering questions, that one would ask, like why on earth did they pick this NRHO thing? And what is the value add of that? And in talking through this with Mike, it became clear this was a classic case of having a component of the architecture that was flawed in terms of what it could do, and then trying to design everything else around that in a way that you were piling on risk in the wrong places. And, as a nuclear engineer or an aerospace engineer, any engineering discipline that requires looking at all of the pieces and assigning the appropriate compromises, if you will, for the sub pieces in order for the whole to be optimized. That's what you learn in a good undergraduate system engineering pursuit. And that art seems to have been lost here completely. So if I sound critical, it's because I came in at this not with a deep experience and knowledge and background that Mike had, but it was very clear that you didn't need that to actually see from a system engineering perspective how poorly designed this is. And notably, if you recall, when we started talking, I pointed out that sometimes you got to let your idea go. I think NASA imposed upon the contractors this NRHO and wouldn't let go of it. It's clever, but it's wrong. It's just not optimal at all for the overarching problem you're trying to solve. So, Mike, I hope I didn't sound too harsh there, but
no, you're not.
That's
maybe
my
not harsh enough. I should explain that the limitation that Lisa is describing, that the architecture tries to work around, is the inability of the Orion crew vehicle to get into orbit and back out of orbit, both. It can do one or the other, but not both at the moon. And so when she refers to NRHO, that's the near rectilinear halo orbit that has a 6.5-day period around the moon. And with that period around the moon, there's an optimal opportunity to land on the moon every 6.5 days. You can fudge that a little bit depending on the amount of fuel reserve you're willing to carry, but the good options for landing on or getting off the moon only occur every 6.5 days. And that's a very risky thing. And the point she's making is that the entire plan of the United States for returning to the moon I would view it, and she would view it, as a collection of Band-Aids around that one thing. And there are better ways to do it. It's very poor system engineering practice to, I'll use the expression common to all tennis players of playing around your backhand. Mm-hmm. You have a weakness in one area of your game and you play around it. Not a good idea.
Right.
No, it's, the centrality in the plan of what many call the gateway, essentially a space station, as you mentioned, in the near rectilinear halo orbit. It seems the commitment to that is so strong and driving much else.
Yes.
And there's really a good chance you might end up with a space station in a peculiar orbit and nothing else. I'm somewhat concerned about if we make what's already harder for no good reason and riskier for no good reason, I'm concerned that it won't happen at all, or it won't happen in any timely fashion.
That's the complete summary of what I was getting at, Ken, is the challenge here, and we see it, by the way, in other areas, that complex systems really require good system engineering. That sounds very obvious, but system engineering as a discipline is often reduced to checklists and documentation, and people forget the real essence of system engineering is to ensure that you're balancing your risks across your components. You've got a risk matrix that allows you to assess where you're assigning your risks and if it makes sense to do so. And importantly, to the point you were just making and we talked about earlier, if it's not the right answer, let it go. People get so wed to their ideas, they cannot let it go. And I would state, and I know this may offend some people, but I would state that NASA has just refused to let go of a poorly conceived solution to a problem in its overall architecture, which is this NRHO.
Yes, it's almost, we mentioned culture earlier. When speaking to folks that are in the decision path related to this, there's a lot of language almost making me feel that, well, we've been, there's sort of this Mars forward obsession, and I'm all for Mars. It's not the point I'm trying to make. If we pick a poor place to land, or if we pick a strange architecture for the lunar mission, it's not really Mars forward. It's nowhere forward. But there's some feeling that if we do it too much like Apollo, that in some way it's not satisfying. And I'm concerned about that. I really am very, very concerned about the direction we're on currently.
I've never understood the idea that you have to do something different just to be different. If something worked well, then I tend to think a good engineer expands on what worked well.
Exactly.
And when you hit a roadblock, maybe you change directions, but I just don't get the idea that it's not satisfying unless we do it somehow differently. Let me just say for a moment, let me start with the idea that I'm going to respect the requirement that I want to land 4 people on the moon this time and that I want to be able to stay there for a week instead of 2 people for 3 days. Okay, that's a nice goal. That's a modest expansion of what was accomplished in Apollo, and yet doubling the number of people and doubling the stay time allows you to begin thinking about the future. So respecting those requirements, the first thing that I asked myself was, well, why wouldn't you just fly 2 Apollos? I mean, that'll give you 4 people on the moon, and you could put more provisions in the lander, and you could be there for a week. So it struck me that it should not be significantly more complex to put 4 people on the moon than to fly 2 missions of 2 people each. And if you're creating much more complexity beyond that, you're probably doing it wrong.
Exactly.
If that makes any sense, Ken?
It does. And for our listeners, I want to repeat the name of the paper in case they're looking it up. And we'll also have a link to it in our show notes. But the paper is called A System Architecture for Human Lunar Return. And it is indeed a good paper. And there'll be a link in the show notes for convenience.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
In the paper, the 2 of you propose a dual-launch lunar landing architecture, which we've touched on a little bit, and it's a simpler architecture offering lower risks for the crew, and overall mission risk is reduced. Can you elaborate on this just a little for, the 100,000-foot level so people can see what the issues are?
Well, the dual launch approach that we outlined in the paper basically proceeds by you use the first launch to deploy a lunar lander into lunar orbit. It goes without a crew on board, and it sits and waits in a lunar parking orbit for the crew to be launched. The difference here from Apollo, of course, is that Apollo was a single launch approach with both a crew and lander on one big stack. But if you want to double the number of people on the moon and you need a larger lander, then probably you're not going to do that very easily with just one big launch. So we'll divide the problem up and first send the lander and then send the crew and let them meet up in lunar orbit and go to the surface and come back from there. So that's really the essence of it. And then the problem that Lisa and I both mentioned earlier, which is that the current Orion command and service module is not capable of by itself getting into and out of lunar orbit. So we add a lunar orbit insertion stage. In the paper, we cited a stage that was in production at the time the paper was written. There's a better stage available now that's in production. It wasn't in production then, and we'd probably use the better stage, but that's kind of irrelevant. The point is that the problem was cited earlier, that the Orion cannot get itself into and out of a useful lunar orbit, is solved by giving it some help, not by creating a whole complex architecture and a multiple set of refueling flights and all of that. I'll stop there. Am I making any sense, Ken?
You are, and it was a nice, clear discussion of it. We've hit on some of the concerns that a reasonable person would have with the Artemis plan as it exists now. What are some other issues that have arisen in your thoughts, technical or programmatic?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the paper we highlighted a couple of risks that would be eliminated essentially from this approach. One is just the number of flights that you have to take to low Earth orbit in the current architecture leads to a certain probability of failure over time.
Mm-hmm.
And we address that, and that's simple statistics. I think that's pretty clear. The boil-off issue is another one we bring up, which is not a problem in our architecture, which also is quite an issue in the current architecture. So there's, and that's what when Mike earlier referenced a low TRL, there's sort of an assumption of an insert miracle right now for the boil-off problem. So I think we've tried to minimize the risks we identified as the 5x5 equivalents, right, in a risk matrix. How do you address them, and how do you come up with a simpler approach? The challenges that remain, though, to answer your question, and it's one that Mike and I have discussed significantly, it won't surprise you. It's not really technical. It's people, culture, acquisition approach, all of those kinds of things. The proof of concept, if you will, that we outline, I think is credible, but you immediately get pushback around the idea of using SLS, for example, and what does that mean? Can we rely on that provider? Can we rely on that program to be robust enough? These are real questions, and they have nothing to do with, is it possible technically? It has to do with, can we rely on the performance of both NASA and a contractor base to give us what we need once we've identified the credible approach going forward. And Mike and I have talked about that because you see that not just at NASA, you see that across the government generally. It's not enough to have a good idea and a good plan. You have to have the ability to execute that plan. And to be frank, I think that NASA has demonstrated a weakness there. So I would argue that the best approach going forward would be something that allows competition for the maximum possible extent to enable the various contractors out there to propose how they would best achieve these requirements to get us to the moon, but not to impose requirements that make no sense, like NRHW.
Yep.
I'm sorry, NRHO onto them. So an artificially constrained architecture will lead you to solutions, regardless of who the contractors are, that don't make sense because your starting point doesn't make sense. So just saying, we'd like to have an open competition ultimately, and the SLS is one approach. But if you have a better way of getting to the similar idea, i.e., can you get 45 metric tons to TLI, show us how you would do it. And if you can do that, then let's look at making that possible. It's the acquisition part, Ken, is very, very hard because we've overprescribed. I should say NASA has overprescribed a solution that doesn't make sense, and they got what they got, and they're not letting go of it. And they need to let go and say, let's look at this in a different way. And then let's open it up in a competitive way that allows people to respond to a better architectural approach.
I agree. And I'll come back actually to procurement issues in a minute, because I do think that's a problem. And, we saw it starting to take shape quite a while ago, and it bears the fruit now of decisions that were made some time back. The paper, your joint paper, is really quite nicely detailed in explaining your recommendations for a lunar architecture. One wonders, I think I know the answer, unfortunately, but I'm compelled to ask. One wonders, how has NASA responded to your recommendations? And also, secondarily, what feedback have you received from others in the human spaceflight community more generally? But start with NASA.
Well, I have to say NASA has not responded. So if I can say that differently, but I can't really add much content. In the human spaceflight community, I have, and I think both Lisa and I have, the feedback we've received is always that, oh, well, this makes sense, and I agree with you completely. I haven't found a single person coming to me and saying, this doesn't work, and here's why. But right after someone tells me that they agree with the approach, they say, well, but I there's nothing I can do to help.
Yes,
so that's what I hear.
I've actually heard about your paper from former senior executives at the agency involved in human spaceflight, very capable people, I might add. And they all basically said what you just said. Yes, this makes sense to me, and this is achievable, unlike the current program. And I think they have also had no success in engaging in a productive conversation with the agency on this.
That's right. It goes back to that age-old problem, Ken. of speaking truth to power and then power being willing to hear truth. So both of those are required in order for progress to be made.
I so agree. So Sean Duffy, the Secretary of Transportation and acting NASA administrator, has opened the door, in a sense, to some additional lander ideas, since there are growing concerns that the two companies you mentioned with contracts currently may not be ready in time for the current time schedule. Please explain your thoughts on the approaches of SpaceX and Blue Origin, and whether bringing on another lander development group would actually improve the U.S. chances of competing successfully with China in maintaining our schedule, or it would just further complicate matters. People have asked me to ask you about this specific question, and what would your thoughts be at this point?
So I'm going to answer first, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mike, because I don't think that it is all fair to put the blame of the current situation at the feet of SpaceX and Blue Origin. They were asked to respond to an architecture that NASA has put out there and stubbornly refused to let go of. So until NASA owns this, as they need to start with a better architecture and ask the right thing of the performers, I don't see how they can say, well, SpaceX won't be ready or Blue Origin won't be ready. Nobody's going to be ready because your architecture is wrong. Your solution is wrong. Let it go, NASA. Start with the right one. Mm-hmm. And that's my frustration. You can hear in my voice the lack of ability to just own up to that on the government side, on the NASA side, to say, we're doing this wrong. We need to ask something different. I think SpaceX is a highly capable company. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a revelation for anybody. I'm excited about Blue Origin entering in and trying to offer its own capabilities, but they have to be asked to do the right thing.
Yes, I agree.
And right now, they're not. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike on this. I have a very strong opinion on that.
Well, I agree with all that was said. And I will add that there are other companies out there that could offer an approach for taxpayer money, because going to the moon is not a commercial proposition. This is a program that the U.S. government must support and must stay behind. But I guess the fundamental point that I want to make is it is taxpayer money that's at risk here. And it needs to be governed by appropriately capable people at whatever government agency the program is lodged. This is fundamentally, to me, I'm struggling for my words, as you can tell, and I'm sorry. This is not fundamentally about NASA or not NASA. This is fundamentally about the responsibilities for managing taxpayer-funded efforts correctly. So when Lisa says, and I quite agree, that NASA has prescribed the wrong architecture to which companies must bid, NASA is also responsible for saying no to plans that contractors bring back that clearly will not work. It boggles my mind that NASA has approved an architecture from both SpaceX and Blue Origin that feature multiple refueling flights, when anyone who knows anything at all about space systems engineering knows that this is a very low TRL technology that should be demonstrated carefully in low Earth orbit with and not be in series with an actual program of timely return to the moon. So NASA has a responsibility, a government agency has a responsibility to avoid prescribing or over-prescribing things that they shouldn't prescribe. They also have a responsibility for saying no to stupid, and that wasn't done either. So let me stop there.
Mm-hmm. There's a degree of courage and clarity that's necessary in senior government executives, in my view, to respect what Mike brought up as the significant responsibility to effectively use the limited taxpayer's purse. And
Correct.
This is in short supply.
And that's because, if I can break in, that's because large government programs that are being done on behalf of the society at large are not done in a free market. This is not a situation in which we don't try to decide which restaurants in a big city are the right ones. We let the free market sort out the problem of which restaurants are good and which ones you don't want to go to a second time. When you're innovating in a non-free market, using taxpayer funds, there is a requirement for capable judgment on the part of the government officials who are steering those taxpayer funds.
Right.
Absolutely. And continuing on this theme of having to do with responsible use of taxpayer funds, we've been talking today about returning to the moon and building a permanent lunar base, and we've touched on the idea of eventually a human mission to Mars. Both of these are ambitious programs, one more than the other, but both very ambitious. NASA's budget for the fiscal year of 2025 is approximately $24.9 billion, which represents about 0.4% of total federal spending. A remarkably modest number, but I think it could suffice. But right now, there's a proposal to cut NASA's budget by 24% to $18.8 billion. This comes at a time when China is investing more money in its space programs and launching multiple missions to close the space gap in comparison with U.S. capabilities. Plans to send humans to the moon by 2030, establish a lunar base by 2035. It's also talking about possible Mars missions in the future, and its Tiangong space station became operational in 2023. So let's be clear about something. China is very much our adversary, and it seems a bit, or more than a bit, nearsighted to be cutting NASA's budget when not only China, but many other nations as well, are investing heavily in their space programs. And I wonder what your thoughts are on this and the whole budget issue. When you look, we were talking earlier about Apollo and, the percentage of total federal spending during Apollo was phenomenally different than 0.4%.
Well, that's true, Ken. During Apollo, NASA budgets hit in round numbers a peak of 4% of the national budget, not 0.4%. But before I get to the question of budget, I always want to know that the money is being spent wisely. If NASA is not assigned a mission that matters on behalf of American society, then I frankly don't care what its budget is.
Of course not.
So it needs to be crystal clear that the fundamental purpose of the nation's space agency is to pioneer the human frontier. Science is nice to do. I've worked on a bunch of NASA science missions over my career, and I'm proud of that fact. Okay, but that's not NASA's fundamental responsibility. It should be and is to pioneer the space frontier. If that's not done, then I don't care what budget the agency has. I don't care whether there is a NASA. NASA was a creation of President Eisenhower's, who wanted to demonstrate that the United States could move peacefully against adversaries. The adversary in that era was the Soviet Union. But there was discussion at the times, which frankly I remember, about whether or not the mission of pioneering the space frontier should be left to DoD. I'll remind everybody that I have mentioned Lewis and Clark expedition a couple of times. Meriwether Lewis was an Army captain, and Pikes Peak is named after another Army captain. So the creation of and assignment of space exploration to NASA is an artifact of history that in the long run is really irrelevant. What is relevant is having an important mission sufficiently well funded, correctly and properly led by expert people to do something that matters. And discussion of whether we're going to put more budget or less budget into NASA without clarifying those other, to me, larger issues is kind of beside the point.
It's also important to appreciate that NASA is more than just human spaceflight. And when we talk about NASA and its budget, for many of our listeners, we naturally think of it in terms of, human spaceflight. And of course, that's fundamentally and critically important, but the agency does much more than that. And it's a complex situation. Certainly, though, if your agency is setting about to do things that don't matter and in a fashion that won't work, the budget is not your biggest issue.
Yeah, I mean, Ken, one of the things I learned early at DARPA, which I just really have fully embraced in every step of my career, is whenever you were about to start a program, it took two things to start a program. One was a high-quality idea, which you determined if that was met by answering the Heilmeier questions, which I'm sure some of your listeners are well aware of. including, very importantly, the clear, measurable milestones by which you would define progress and stop if progress could not be made. But the second and often forgotten part that's just as critical is you have to have someone who can execute that program. And if you didn't, it didn't matter how good the idea was, it was not done. So those were the two ingredients. The budget was never the first thing. It was always the last thing. In fact, as a program manager at DARPA, and we continued this at IARPA, contractors would always ask, what's the budget for the program? And the answer was, it depends on the quality of the ideas we get. If we get a lot of them, there'll be more funding. If we don't, there won't be any funding. So there's a big part of this around execution that cannot be minimized. People tend to overemphasize, well, NASA needs to do these things, so it needs a lot of money. Well, if NASA can't do those things, and frankly, for me as a taxpayer, they haven't proven themselves worthy of a budget to get to the moon because they have failed so far. I'm being very blunt now. Then, you have to look at the importance of the mission and whether NASA is capable of executing it. Those are both very important elements. No matter how much money you throw at something, if you cannot execute it, it does not end well. And Mike and I can both give lots of examples. And by the way, that's not limited to NASA by any means, as you can imagine.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree with what you've both said, though, you need both. You need the budget and the people, but the people are the limiting factor. And it's what sort of concerned me. There's been a big drain in high quality engineering folks at NASA headquarters and other places in recent years that are focused on human spaceflight, and that is.
But Ken, it's not the quality of the technical people; it's the quality of the spine of those people. We just talked about how people who understood the points that Mike has been making in testimony,
yes,
and going back, right? These are people who are really smart, and they nod up and down, and they say he has it right, and then they refuse to speak up. So it's not. To me, the concern isn't quality of technical people so much as quality of the integrity and the willingness to stand up and say, this is what we're going to do because it's the right thing and we'll make sure we get it done. And then this is what we need to do it.
Yeah, when I talk
I'm sorry if I sound too blunt, but somewhere along the line, someone's going to have to just stand up and recognize this. And I have not seen evidence that NASA can do that.
At this point, blunt is helpful. And if the patient will be helped, the physician must be truthful. When we talk about the quality of technical leadership, it doesn't just refer to their engineering skill, but it refers to some of the factors that you just mentioned, Lisa, like integrity, courage.
Exactly.
Without those, the other aspects really don't matter.
That's what I was trying to say, Ken, yes.
Also, I want to make a budgetary point, Ken. Back almost 20 years ago now, 18 years ago, for the 50th anniversary of Sputnik, I was asked to write for Aviation Week in Space Technology an essay on what I thought the next 50 years would look like. So as a part of a budget exercise there, I went back and I took an inflation-adjusted budget look at NASA for 3 chunks of 15 years and 5 chunks of 10 years. And I appreciate that those don't both add up to 50. But I looked at the real dollar budget that NASA had in 10-year increments and in 15-year increments. And what I found, to my surprise, was that if you average the money out over a 10 or 15-year chunk, that the Apollo era was not the era in which NASA had the most money. NASA actually had the most money in the post-Challenger era. Okay, which ended with the time, and of course that I was administrator. So the latter third or the latter fifth of NASA's career at the time that I was there was the period in which they had the most money. So I would invite anyone to compare the progress made in the first 15 years of NASA's existence versus the 15 years that ended in 2007 and ask which period you would be prouder of. Mm-hmm. It's not about the money. Yes, it is about the money. It's always about the money. All right, but it isn't just about the money because it's also about what you do with the money.
Of course, but it is about the money to some extent. In D.C., as you two know as well as me or better, in D.C., budget or lack thereof speaks volumes about whether as a nation we're serious about something. And I actually don't think we're serious about returning to the moon at this point. And we were very serious about it in Apollo. And I think that's the fundamental difference. The best and the brightest in our culture, many of whom worked on Apollo to accomplish it. And as a nation, we were committed to it at the highest level. I just don't feel that's true currently.
Well, that's certainly the case. And it is also the case that the best people always go where the best programs are.
For sure. So as we wrap up our discussion, I want to come back to something that was hinted at earlier. And I'd love your collective thoughts on the way NASA is contracting by buying services rather than funding a development program with specified, clear requirements for the systems that are needed. I think this issue is actually close to the heart of some of the challenges we've been discussing. And I wondered if we could just talk about this for a few minutes. The contracting method for buying services. I remember a sort of intense NASA Advisory Council meeting quite a while ago where one of the current prominent contractors was saying, look, it said to me, in fact, when you hail a cab or an Uber, you're contracting for a service. And this is sort of the model we should have. You don't get to say how many seats it has, or you don't specify the requirements for the vehicle when you call your Uber. As long as it generally is acceptable, you get in and pay, and your service is provided. And I said to the person, I said, yeah, but also the government, if I'm the government, I'm not paying for developing the Uber. I'm not paying for the engineering of the Uber. And I don't see it as analogous at all. And spaceflight is not like an Uber ride. So I found it disingenuous. But I do think the contracting issue is part of the issue where internally in the government, you lose a lot of talent pool and you lose a lot of focus when there's not a development program, when you're essentially just hiring services. Now, you both may feel differently about it, but that was something that I didn't like the direction then and still really don't like it for some aspects of development.
So, Ken, I think it's perhaps not quite the right way to think about it. And I know the contracting services model has been very popularized by the Silicon Valley business model, I think, which is what you're referencing. And we hear this a lot in the DoD as well. I think of it more as a difference between a traditional RFP approach where you're over-prescribing in many cases, as we have here, exactly what the solution is and what you expect contractors to do to meet it. And you take away, by doing that, the opportunity for better ideas to come from outside of how to solve the problem that you are trying to solve. The DARPA model, which as you can tell, I'm a big fan of, actually assumes from the get-go that the best ideas are outside of DARPA and not inside, even though they pride themselves on hiring very, very good program managers. And as I said, they require their program managers to go through a process of determining whether or not the problem they're proposing to solve has a potential solution. But nonetheless, when they solicit, they use a process by which they ask for the solutions, the best ideas from the outside, and then they assess through quality people inside whether those ideas have merit. And then they fund as many good ones as they can, and usually intentionally with different approaches, because nobody knows in many cases what the right approach truly is, right? So I think what you're seeing is on that spectrum, there's a desire, which I agree with, from the private sector to say to the government, you don't have all the answers. Even if you have some of the world's smartest people, and I do think at a technical level, NASA can still make that claim, absolutely. But the best ideas, in order for them to truly come to you, you want to be open to different solutions. You must be very clear on the problem you're trying to solve. And you must be very clear on how you're going to measure progress against that problem. And let us determine, to your point, how many seats are in the car, what color the car is. That's really, I think, the essence of the argument. And where you draw that line between how much specificity is required in order to get solutions that will ultimately get you the problem solved is always challenging. And that comes down to some debate that people constantly have. I do think, and maybe I'm biased because I hold Mike in such high regard, but I was there and I have spoken with people who were there at SpaceX at the time. I do think the NASA COTS model balances those challenges very well. And it's very similar to the DARPA model I just described. and look at the positive outcome that the COTS model generated. So we don't use the word services there, although ultimately that's what we got, right, in the long run. And we didn't tell SpaceX or Northrop Grumman specifics about how they were going to achieve the objective, but we provided broad, clear criteria. And importantly, to your point, we had program managers on the government side who understood enough about the tech and the problem to identify good ideas that were plausible. Let me give it over to Mike because I just hogged the mic.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I agree with all of that, but I also want to get on the table the issue that Ken is raising. So first of all, I'm a huge free market person, so I'll confess that up front. But a free market requires that there be, in order to function in the normal sense of somebody who has studied economics, the free market requires a reasonable multiplicity of sellers and a reasonable multiplicity of buyers in order that you can have what are, arm's length transactions in the conventional sense of the term. For truly large cutting edge projects, there is only the government as the customer and there are very few potential suppliers. And so expertise in the government is required if taxpayer money is to be apportioned wisely. I'm really not very interested in the opinions of people who know nothing about submarines as to what kinds of submarines the Navy needs to host fleet ballistic missiles or be attack submarines. That's a very specialized community, and it needs very specialized decision-making by people who, frankly, have the future of our nation as one of their responsibilities. And the free market just is not going to be very helpful there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mike and Lisa, this has been super fun, and it's as great as I had hoped it would be. Thank you so much for joining us today on STEM Talk.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having us.
You're welcome for the third time, Ken.
Yeah, you two make a terrific team, and I think the listeners will very much enjoy this conversation.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
For those of us who were around back in the 60s, following the Apollo 11 mission and watching Neil Armstrong become the first human to set foot on the lunar surface was an accomplishment that captivated not only our nation's imagination, but the world's imagination. Today, we discuss the Artemis program, which plans to return Americans to the lunar surface and begin building a permanent settlement on the moon. As you can tell from today's conversation with Mike and Lisa, this is a substantial and challenging undertaking in which the details of mission architecture matter greatly. It is very important that NASA get this right, and it does seem that some immediate course corrections are needed, and I hope they make these corrections soon. If you enjoyed this interview as much as I did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage, where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.